Ethan and his friends had been planning their camping trip for weeks. They wanted to leave the city behind and spend a few days immersed in nature, surrounded by towering trees and the sounds of the forest. Ethan, ever the adventurer, had insisted on exploring a new trail he'd read about online, an unmarked path that promised stunning views and complete isolation. The group arrived at the campsite around midday, setting up tents and gathering wood for a fire later. The air was filled with laughter and the scent of pine as they settled in, thrilled to be away from their phones and city routines. They cooked lunch, shared stories, and marveled at the sheer quiet of the woods. As evening approached, Ethan felt a familiar itch, the call to explore. "Hey, anyone up for a quick hike?" he asked, gesturing toward the dense forest behind their campsite. His friends exchanged glances, some of them hesitant. "We should stick to the trails we know, right?" asked Laura, always the cautious one. "Come on. It's still light out. We'll go for half an hour, maybe see a sunset view, and head back," Ethan urged. Eventually, two of his friends, Ben and Tara, agreed to join him. They grabbed their flashlights and a single bottle of water, assuming it would be a short hike. The three made their way through the trees, Ethan leading with a confidence that bordered on reckless. The forest was alive with colors as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting warm, amber light through the branches. They laughed as they walked, swatting at mosquitoes and joking about who'd get scared first. As they ventured deeper, however, the landscape started to look unfamiliar. The trees grew closer together, and the path they thought they were following seemed to vanish beneath the thick underbrush. "Are you sure this is the way?" Ben asked, a slight edge to his voice. Ethan waved a hand dismissively. "Of course, it's just a bit farther." But as the minutes ticked by, the light faded faster than they'd expected. Shadows stretched across the ground, and an uneasy silence fell over the group. Tara's voice broke the quiet. "Maybe we should turn back. It's getting dark." Ethan's confidence began to waver, but he didn't want to admit it. "Okay, let's head back. We just came from this direction, right?" As they turned to retrace their steps, the forest seemed to close in, every tree and shadow blending into the next. They walked for what felt like ages, but their campsite was nowhere in sight. "I don't recognize any of this," Tara whispered, her voice tinged with panic. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to keep calm. "Okay, let's just stop for a second and think. We have flashlights and a bottle of water. We're fine." The group huddled together, turning on their flashlights. But the beams of light only served to emphasize the thick darkness surrounding them. They shone the lights in all directions, hoping to catch a glimpse of something familiar, but the trees and underbrush stretched endlessly in every direction. "Maybe we should stay put," Ben suggested. "People always say it's better to wait in one spot if you're lost." Ethan's mind raced. He'd led them out here, confident in his sense of direction, and now they were lost. A mix of guilt and frustration bubbled up inside him. I'm sorry, guys. I thought I knew where we were going." Tara placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's okay. We'll figure this out together." They decided to wait for a while, hoping someone back at the campsite would notice their absence. They sat in a circle, sharing the bottle of water in small sips, each one of them haunted by the dark, silent forest surrounding them. Hours passed, and the night grew colder. The distant hoots of owls and the occasional rustle in the bushes kept them on edge. Ben shivered, rubbing his arms. "We didn't bring any extra clothes or food. We can't stay out here all night." The reality of their situation started to sink in. They were cold, tired, and completely lost. Ethan felt a heavy weight on his chest. He'd wanted an adventure, but he hadn't been prepared for the consequences. "Let's keep walking," Ethan finally said, his voice steadier than he felt. "We'll follow the slope downhill. It should lead us to a river or stream, and we can follow that until we find help." Reluctantly, the others agreed, and they started moving again. The darkness seemed endless, and every step felt like a test of their resolve. The forest was no longer the inviting sanctuary it had been earlier in the day. Now, It felt like a maze, each tree a silent guardian keeping them trapped. Hours later, exhausted and disheartened, they stumbled upon a narrow stream. Relief flooded over them, and they followed it, hoping it would lead them to safety. They walked along the bank, too tired to speak, their breaths visible in the cold night air. Just when they thought they couldn't go any farther, the trees began to thin. In the distance, a faint light flickered, someone's flashlight, or maybe a distant campfire. Hope surged through them, and they quickened their pace. As they approached, they realized it was indeed their campsite, their friends waving their flashlights in the distance, calling their names. A wave of relief washed over Ethan and his friends as they stumbled back into the campsite, greeted by worried looks and a flurry of questions. They explained what had happened, their words overlapping in a jumble of relief and apologies. Ethan couldn't shake the lingering sense of guilt as they sat around the fire that night, sharing stories of their ordeal. He knew he'd learned a lesson he wouldn't soon forget: nature was beautiful but unforgiving, and even the most seasoned adventurers needed to respect its dangers. The next morning, as they packed up and prepared to leave, Ethan felt a mix of exhaustion and gratitude. He'd been lost, but he'd found something more valuable than the thrill of adventure: a new respect for the wilderness and the friends who'd stood by him, even in the darkest of nights. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip. Just the four of us, my mom, dad, little brother Danny, and me, deep in the pines, where there was no cell service, no traffic, no noise but the occasional crackle of a branch or a bird's call. We'd camped in the same place every year since I was little, a spot we called Whispering Pines. My dad swore it was magic, full of good energy and untouched nature. But this time, something was different. I felt it as soon as we stepped out of the car, a strange quietness in the air, like the forest was holding its breath. We pitched our tent near the clearing we'd always used, and Danny and I helped gather wood for the fire. The air was unusually still, and though we heard the chirping of crickets and the rustling of leaves, I noticed the birds had gone silent. It was almost as if they, too, sensed something was amiss. We spent the day hiking, fishing, and telling stories around the fire. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, we were all sitting by the fire, roasting marshmallows and trying to one-up each other with spooky stories. "Have you heard the one about the ghost of Whispering Pines?" Dad teased, holding a flashlight to his face to cast eerie shadows. Danny groaned, "That's just something you made up to scare us." My dad chuckled, but before he could respond, a sudden sound froze us in place, a distant whisper, faint but unmistakable, drifting from the depths of the forest. It was barely louder than the rustling leaves, but clear enough to make my skin prickle. "What was that?" I whispered. Dad shook his head. "Probably just the wind." But something about the way he said it didn't sit right with me. I looked into the trees, searching for whatever might have made that sound. It was so faint it could have been a trick of my imagination, but I knew I'd heard something. As the fire died down, we got into the tent, but I couldn't sleep. Outside, the whispering had started again, this time closer, weaving through the branches, drifting just beyond the canvas walls. I told myself it was the wind, just like Dad said, but it didn't feel right. It was too intentional, too steady. Finally, I nudged Danny, who was fast asleep, oblivious. "Do you hear that?" He mumbled, half asleep. "Hear what?" "That whispering," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He rolled over, grumbling something about my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond our campsite, watching us. The next morning, I was surprised to see Dad looking just as restless as I felt. He glanced around, almost like he was expecting someone, or something, to be watching. But he forced a smile and told us it was time for a hike. We set off into the woods, following an old trail that wound between ancient trees draped in moss. Danny ran ahead, snapping pictures with his little camera, while Mom and Dad walked a few paces behind, whispering to each other. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see a shadow or a figure among the trees, but there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the forest, broken by an occasional bird call. After an hour or so, we stopped by a small creek to rest. Danny was collecting stones when he looked up, frowning. "Who's that?" We all turned, and for a second, I thought I saw a figure, just at the edge of my vision, a man, or maybe a woman, standing on the other side of the creek. But when I blinked, they were gone. "I didn't see anyone," Mom said, her voice tense. She looked at Dad, and I could tell she was just as spooked as I was. "It was probably a shadow," Dad said, though he didn't sound convinced. We decided to head back to camp, but the trail felt wrong. It was as if the forest had shifted, each tree looking the same as the last, making it impossible to tell if we were going the right way. Mom kept glancing at Dad, her face tight with worry, while Danny kept insisting he saw something moving just out of sight. Then we heard it again, a faint whisper, drifting through the trees. This time, it was louder, almost like someone was calling our names. The sound made my stomach twist, a hollow dread filling my chest. I looked at my parents, but they were as confused and frightened as I was. "What is that?" I asked, my voice shaking. Dad swallowed, looking around with narrowed eyes. "I don't know." The whispering grew louder, circling us, surrounding us, though we couldn't see anyone. Mom clutched Danny's hand, her eyes wide with fear. Then, without warning, the trees seemed to close in around us. The sky darkened as a heavy fog rolled in, shrouding the forest in an eerie, ghostly light. "We need to get back to camp," Dad said, his voice steady but urgent. We hurried along the path, our footsteps echoing in the unnatural silence. The whispering followed us, growing louder with each step. I tried to tune it out, but the words became clearer, taking on an unsettling familiarity. They were our voices, whispering back at us, repeating our own words in a mocking, distorted tone. "Who's there?" Danny's voice called, though he hadn't spoken. The disembodied echo sent a chill down my spine. It was as if the forest had come alive, replaying every word we'd spoken, twisting it into something dark and malevolent. Finally, we stumbled into our campsite, but something was wrong. Our tent was gone, as were our supplies. It was like we'd never been there. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Dad looked around, his face pale. "I don't know." Mom tried to call for help, but her phone was dead. We were alone, trapped in the middle of nowhere, with only the whispering forest around us. Then we saw them, figures, standing just beyond the clearing, their faces hidden in shadow. They watched us in silence, unmoving, almost like statues. I couldn't tell if they were human or something else entirely, but their presence filled me with a primal fear, like some ancient instinct warning me to run. We backed away, but the figures moved with us, closing in from all sides. The whispers grew louder, a deafening cacophony that drowned out everything else, until I couldn't even hear my own thoughts. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Just when I thought we were done for, the whispers stopped. The figures vanished, leaving us alone in the empty clearing. The fog lifted, and the sky brightened, as if nothing had happened. Our tent was back, exactly where we'd left it, with all our supplies untouched. We looked at each other, dazed and confused, unsure if we'd imagined the whole thing. "We're leaving," Dad said, his voice shaking. We packed up in silence, none of us daring to speak. As we drove away, I glanced back at the forest, half expecting to see those shadowy figures watching us from the trees. But there was nothing. Just the empty woods, silent and still, as if it had been waiting for us to leave. We never went back to Whispering Pines. To this day, I don't know what happened that night, but sometimes, when I'm lying in bed, I can still hear those whispers, calling my name from the darkness. The autumn night was cool and serene as Jake, Mia, and Alex set up camp deep in the heart of Blackwood Forest. Known for its sprawling oaks and occasional bear sighting, the forest was remote, silent, and exactly what they'd wanted, an escape from their city life, which felt suffocating after months of monotony. They'd come to experience the raw beauty of nature, without distractions, phones left in the car 2 miles away. After a hearty dinner over the campfire, they exchanged ghost stories, laughing and daring each other to tell one scarier than the last. The forest seemed unusually silent, like it was listening. But as the fire burned low, Mia noticed something odd. "Do you guys hear that?" she whispered, her face paling. "What?" Jake scoffed, shaking his head, but Alex frowned, turning his head toward the dark trees. It started as a faint murmur, just beyond the trees, like voices in a distant conversation. Only there was no one around for miles. The group looked at each other, their faces illuminated only by the fire's glow. "Probably just the wind," Jake said, trying to sound brave, but Mia shook her head. "No, listen, it sounds like someone whispering." They strained to listen, the fire crackling softly as the whispers grew louder. Words were indecipherable, but there was a definite rhythm, an odd cadence, like chanting. Nervous laughs dissolved into uneasy silence. Just then, a sudden breeze snuffed out the fire, plunging them into darkness. Jake fumbled with his flashlight, and as it flicked on, the beam caught something in the shadows. A figure. Pale and gaunt, it stood among the trees, staring back at them. Alex gasped, and Mia clasped her hand over her mouth, stifling a scream. The figure was still, but its eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to bore into each of them, as though peeling back their very thoughts. Its face was featureless, save for those unblinking, hollow eyes. What is that?" Mia stammered, stepping back. Jake, trying to hide his shaking hands, whispered, "I don't know. Maybe it's just someone camping?" Alex's voice was barely a whisper. "No one else is supposed to be here." In the eerie silence, the chanting grew louder, filling the air with strange, nonsensical words. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing through the trees. The figure moved, barely a twitch, but enough to reveal it was real, alive. It raised an arm, beckoning, a grotesque grin spreading across its face. "Run!" Alex yelled, grabbing Mia's hand as they sprinted away from the figure, tripping over roots and rocks in their mad dash. Jake was close behind, casting frantic glances over his shoulder, but the figure stayed in the shadows, following, just beyond their sight. After what felt like an eternity, they stumbled into a small clearing, breathless, their flashlights barely illuminating their surroundings. But the figure was gone. Silence fell, pressing in on them from all sides. "Did we lose it?" Mia gasped, her voice shaking. Alex looked around, his eyes wide with terror. I don't know." Jake, catching his breath, forced a laugh. "Maybe we imagined it. Just the stories getting to us." But as he said this, they heard the whispering again, only closer. Right behind them. They spun around, and there it was, standing mere feet away, its eyes fixed on them. It was smiling, revealing rows of sharp, glinting teeth. The chanting grew deafening, filling their heads, each syllable sinking into their minds like claws, tearing at their sanity. Desperate, they ran again, not caring where they were going, just needing to escape the relentless presence. But no matter how fast they ran, it seemed to follow, never in sight, but always there, lingering, watching. After hours of stumbling through the forest, they found themselves back at their campsite. But something was wrong. The tents were gone, and in their place were ancient stones arranged in a circle, each inscribed with strange symbols. "We've been here before, right?" Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. Mia clutched Alex's arm, her face pale. "Yes, but what is this?" The chanting ceased abruptly, leaving a silence so deep it felt unnatural. And then, a new sound, laughter, cold and hollow, echoed around them. The figure stepped into the clearing, finally close enough for them to see its full form. It was tall, impossibly tall, with elongated limbs and skin stretched tight over its bones. Its face was no longer empty, it bore a twisted, inhuman grin, and its eyes were filled with a hunger that froze them in place. As they stood paralyzed, it raised a hand, pointing at them one by one, its mouth moving silently. And then they heard it, not in the air, but in their minds. The whispers, the chanting, it was all there, a chaotic jumble of words and images that tore at their thoughts. "You trespass," it hissed, its voice slithering through their minds like ice. This place is sacred. Mia tried to scream, but no sound came out. Jake grabbed her hand, pulling her back, but the figure stepped forward, blocking their path. You cannot leave, it whispered, the words drilling into their thoughts. You belong to the forest now. With a final, terrible smile, the figure began to dissolve, fading into the trees, but its voice lingered, echoing in their minds. And as it vanished, the chanting returned, louder than ever, filling the air with an unbearable noise. In a frenzy, they ran, desperate to escape the voice that seemed to be all around them. But no matter how far they went, the whispers followed, an endless, mocking chorus that drove them deeper into madness. When dawn finally broke, the forest was empty. Their campsite was gone, the stones scattered as though they'd never been there. But the whispers lingered, faint and distant, a reminder of the night they would never escape. To this day, if you walk deep into Blackwood Forest, you might hear them, the voices of those who tried to leave but never could, their whispers mingling with the trees, a warning to anyone who dares to enter this sacred ground. Under the thin, eerie glow of a crescent moon, four friends gathered around a small campfire deep in an untouched forest. Sarah, Tom, Jessica, and Mike had known each other since childhood and were practically inseparable, bonded by countless camping trips over the years. But this forest was different. The trees stood taller, twisted and gnarled, casting long shadows that seemed to lean in as if listening. Cheers to surviving midterms. Mike raised his mug, and they all laughed, clinking their cups. They shared stories, joked around, and told ghost stories as the fire crackled between them, casting their faces in shifting shadows. Yet, an unspoken tension lingered. Tom, who was usually the most daring, kept looking over his shoulder. Sarah nudged him. Tom, what are you looking at? Tom shook his head. I don't know. Just feels like we're not alone out here. Oh, come on, Jessica teased. You're just spooked because we're out in the middle of nowhere. But as midnight drew closer, the group's laughter faded. Their senses sharpened as the forest around them grew still. The distant hoots of owls stopped, and even the usual rustling of leaves in the wind went silent. They couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. It was well past midnight when the stillness was broken by a scream. A faint, high-pitched wail echoed from deep in the forest, shattering the silence. Mike sat up, heart pounding, sure it was part of a nightmare until he saw the terror on Sarah's face. Did anyone else hear that? She whispered. Tom tried to laugh it off, but his voice was shaky. Probably just an animal. Let's go back to sleep. But Sarah shook her head. That sounded like a person. Reluctantly, they decided to follow the sound, keeping their flashlights low as they ventured into the forest. The trees closed in around them, casting long, thin shadows that seemed to stretch and twist, and the faint cries seemed to come from all directions. Finally, the cries stopped. Silence hung heavy in the air. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. Let's just go back, Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible. As they turned to leave, Tom swore he saw something move in the darkness, a shadow darting between the trees. He froze, his eyes straining to see. But when he looked closer, there was nothing. Back at the camp, they huddled around the fire, forcing nervous laughs and trying to convince themselves it was all just their imaginations. They agreed to ignore it, brushing off the strange experience as the wind or an animal. But that night, each of them dreamed of shadows moving closer, of soft whispers calling their names. When they woke, the strange feeling still lingered. The next day, they tried to shake it off. They spent hours exploring the forest, enjoying the warmth of the sun and almost forgetting the events of the night. Until Sarah found the tracks. The shallow, clawed footprints circled their camp as if something had prowled around them while they slept. They weren't animal prints, nor fully human. The toes were too long, too sharp. We should leave, Tom muttered, his voice low and urgent. This place, it isn't right. Mike, though visibly shaken, insisted they were overreacting. But as they retraced their steps, something unsettling happened. The path seemed to twist and turn, leading them deeper into the forest instead of out. The trees seemed closer, branches leaning over them, blocking out the light. We're lost, Jessica whispered, her face pale. That night, they set up camp again, though none of them felt safe. As they huddled around the campfire, every creak of the trees made them jump. Around midnight, Sarah spotted something at the edge of the firelight, a shadow, tall and still, standing between the trees. Who's there? She whispered, her voice barely audible. She flicked her flashlight toward the figure, but the beam only revealed empty darkness. When she lowered it, the figure was gone. Tom gave a nervous laugh. We're scaring ourselves. But the uneasy feeling gnawed at them, and they took turns keeping watch, each one nodding off from exhaustion until morning. They woke to find Jessica gone. Her tent was unzipped, her sleeping bag empty. They searched the clearing, shouting her name, but there was no answer. Only silence. Just as the sun rose, Tom stumbled on something, Jessica's bracelet, lying on the ground, covered in dirt. Nearby, the same clawed footprints led deeper into the forest. "We're being hunted," Tom whispered, a hollow look in his eyes. Mike tried to keep everyone calm, but even he couldn't hide his growing fear. They spent the entire day searching for Jessica, calling her name until their voices were hoarse, but they found no sign of her. As dusk fell, they returned to the camp, desperate and exhausted. The fire was their only comfort, its light pushing back the darkness. But as the hours passed, the shadows crept closer, and they felt that watching presence again. Near midnight, Sarah screamed. At the edge of the firelight stood Jessica. But something was wrong. Her face was pale, her eyes empty, as if she were sleepwalking. She moved slowly, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Jessica!" Mike shouted, running toward her, but Tom held him back. "That's not her," Tom said, his voice trembling. Jessica stared at them, her mouth twitching into a strange, twisted smile before she turned and disappeared into the darkness. The three of them huddled together, terrified. They didn't sleep, clutching flashlights in each other's hands until dawn. When the sun rose, they found new footprints, Tom's, leading away from the camp. "Tom?" Mike asked, his voice cracking. But Tom was gone. With only each other left, Sarah and Mike were desperate, frantically trying to find a way out. Every path twisted back on itself, leading them in endless circles. They stumbled through the forest, exhausted and hopeless, calling for their friends until their voices broke. By dusk, they were back at the camp, alone, trapped in the nightmare. As night fell, they felt the presence again, shadows moving in the trees, watching, waiting. They huddled close to the fire, clutching each other as the darkness deepened. Sarah's eyes darted around, catching flickers of movement. And then, she saw them. Figures moving between the trees, Jessica and Tom, their faces expressionless, their eyes hollow. They walked with stiff, unnatural movements, as if puppeted by invisible strings. "Mike, do you see?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. He nodded, frozen in horror. The figures moved closer, encircling them. Sarah reached out to grab Mike's hand, but he was already gone, slipping into the shadows as though pulled by unseen forces. "Mike," she screamed, but there was no answer. Now alone, Sarah clutched her flashlight, heart pounding as the shadows grew, closing in. She backed away, stumbling into the trees, trying to escape the empty-eyed figures who followed her every move. She ran until her legs gave out, collapsing to the ground, gasping for breath. The shadows swirled around her, and in the darkness, she saw their faces, Mike, Tom, and Jessica, all blank, all staring, as if waiting. A soft whisper drifted through the air, her name echoing in the darkness. The last thing she saw before the darkness claimed her was her friends' faces, twisted into expressions of silent screams, their mouths moving in whispers she couldn't understand. When a new group of campers stumbled upon the abandoned camp weeks later, they found only silence. Twisted trees loomed overhead, and strange, clawed footprints circled the area. The forest held no trace of the missing campers, only a heavy, watchful stillness. And in the distance, when the wind died down, there was a faint whisper, a voice calling their names from deep within the trees.